Well, your father, Gabor Mate, he became a global phenomenon
Yeah,
for a
so
good
I hear.
reason. Yeah, for many good reasons.
Yeah.
And this latest book, The Myth of Normal, is just another one that kind of cemented the reputation of him. They call him the human whisperer.
Yes.
Which is kind of funny. But true at the same time. And this book, The Myth of Normal, is co-written with you.
Yeah, my name's on the title, on the cover.
So we're gonna jump into it, but before we start doing it, from the people who are not familiar with Gabor or with you, let's just give a little introduction about about who he actually is and his story, which is also revealed here, and it's really not unknown.
Yeah.
But for many people who are just introducing this topic to them, maybe it's going to be probably of big importance in order to understand the big picture around the topic of trauma.
Yeah.
And then I would like to dedicate some time to talk about you and your career, because it's very interesting mix of things that you actually do. And now you're a published author also. So yeah, where would be a good start with your father? Probably 1945, I guess.
44.
44. Well,
Yeah,
44 was when he was born.
Exactly. So, I mean, just keep in mind, I'll be telling this history as his son. So this is a biased telling, but you know, there are some facts of the matter. Yeah, he was born not very far from here. Budapest is what, 2 hours away?
It's 3-4 hours.
3-4 hours. Okay.
Yeah.
So he was born in January 44, which was not the ideal time to be born in this part of the world as a Jew.
Especially in Hungary.
In Hungary?
At the time, yeah.
And the Germans were already, you know, I should know the history in more specific detail than I do, but I do know that the Germans were making their incursion into, you know, toward Budapest from the outside of the country towards the center. And the deportations were happening. So I'm not sure exactly when it was, but sometime that year, my dad's grandparents were deported to Auschwitz. His father, my grandfather, Andor, and now there's a Star Wars show named after him, obviously, Andor. Do you know that show, Andor?
No.
Disney Star Wars has, anyway. That's the lead character, yeah.
The lead character,
Andor,
right.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Andor was my grandfather was away in a forced labor camp with the Hungarian army, and I think a friend smuggled him in, like hiding the fact that he was Jewish. And it was a dangerous time. It was just a really dangerous time, and they were living under terrible, terrible conditions, and the Jews were forced to move into a very small area of the city, you know, the Budapest ghetto. And, you know, because my grandfather did get, I think, like a 2-week leave to come home and see his son, but after that he didn't, my dad didn't see him again for another year. And my grandmother, Judy, didn't have much news from him, or they didn't have news of each other, so they really didn't know if the other was alive or dead. So it was just an extremely stressful time. And my dad tells the story of how his mother called the pediatrician a few days after he was born, saying, "Can you come see us? Gabor won't stop crying." And the doctor said, "Of course I'll come, but I should tell you all my Jewish babies are crying." You know, and the point that my dad makes there is, you know, well, what do Jewish babies know of Nazis and genocides and world wars? They don't. What they feel is the stress of their parents, the emotional absence of their parents, which has nothing to do with a lack of love, anything but. It has to do with just people having limits, you know, and the emotional realities that people live in is what gets transmitted to the child, not the conscious intentions of the parents. And, you know, my grandmother was a hero, and she kept him alive by heroic means. At one point, they managed to find refuge in I think it was a Swiss-operated I might be maybe I'm getting this confused with Schindler's List. I find myself more vague on the details than I really ought to be. But it was a converted glass factory, but just overrun with families. Latrines in the court, no bathrooms, just very unsanitary. My dad had dysentery, almost died. And at a certain point, not on a whim, but on a strong gut feeling, my grandmother, on the spur of the moment, I would say, handed him, and I think he was maybe 8 or 9 months at this point, handed him to a non-Jewish woman on the street and begged her, please take my baby to these relatives who happened to be living in relatively safer circumstances. And because she had no faith that she herself was going to survive, and she knew that he wouldn't. And this woman, talk about another hero, conveyed him safely to these relatives. And I think it was 6 weeks apart. Maybe it was fewer. I don't know. You have to go back and read the book. I'm forgetting the details. But, it was severe separation from his mother to save his life. So these were the circumstances of his birth. And meanwhile, my grandmother got word that her parents had been exterminated in Auschwitz. Her sister had been, my great aunt Marta had been deported to Auschwitz with them, but she actually survived. But they didn't know that until afterwards, when she came home in a Nazi guard uniform, because that's the only clothes she could find after the camps were liberated. So just a very dramatic, horrific, adverse, stressful way to come into the world.
Yeah.
And that was his introduction to planet Earth.
Yeah, and the human race and the society.
And the human race and the society and the realities of being a person, yeah.
Yeah, and already experiencing the first detachment.
Yes.
Yeah, which is going to be very important in understanding, because what I love about this book is because it's intertwined with a lot of personal stories and a lot of testimonials, and which gives it a more of a dramatic touch, which it gives it sort of a novellic type of feeling. It's not just a narrow specific book designed for people within the who has some kind of expertise or knowledge.
Yeah, certainly not
within the area of expertise, right? So, how he ended up in Canada?
Well, the war ended in 1945, and his parents reunited. Very happy to be alive. They had another son, my Uncle János, a couple of years later, born into relatively happy circumstances. And he had a childhood growing up in Budapest. But then, first the Nazis, then the Soviets.
Yeah.
1956, the revolution. He wakes up to the sound of tank thunder of the Red Army coming in to crush the student uprising. And I think basically it was like my grandparents looked at each other and was like, nope.
We're not having this again.
Not again. We're getting out of here. And they trudged out of there, late one night in the rain through the mud into Austria. And there's many stories, in a lot of Hungarian refugees from 1956 in Canada and the United States who all left in the same way around the same time. It's interesting. I keep meeting a lot of, children of that Hungarian story. And I think the options were between New York, Montreal, and Vancouver or something like that. And they ended up on they landed at Halifax. They took a boat and got on a cross-Canada train and didn't get off until it hit the Pacific Ocean, and they ended up in Vancouver. And then they had another son in Vancouver, my Uncle George, who goes by Mate, because he's the Canadian-born Maté,
Mate.
Yeah. Of course, when I was growing up, my dad was Gabor Mate. That's how Vancouverites, that's how Canadians said it,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, and then he met my mother in the late 60s at the University of British Columbia, where she was a cartoonist and he was a political columnist, and she was assigned to draw his caricature.
Yeah, during the Yugoslavia, we had the Yugoslavian time. You know, the former republics. We all used to be one country called Yugoslavia.
Yeah,
especially at the time.
I remember. I was born in '75. I remember this.
Yeah, so yeah, and during the Iron Curtain and during the Soviet era and stuff like that, so we had a lot of refugees from Hungary, and we were helping a lot of them to cross over.
Yeah.
At the time, because Yugoslavia and the President Tito at the time, they were like in this very specific political situation where they could afford it. We were behind the curtain, sort of saying, because if, how they like to say it, if communism was red, Yugoslavian communism was kind of pink. So he was a dictator, but benevolent one.
Yes.
But still a dictator, right? And he held his power also by various means. One of the means was this non-alignment agreement that he had with, Middle Eastern and African countries.
Yeah,
that's basically my origin story, because my father came, to study during the Yugoslavia in the 60s, and he was the member of, Flower Power 1968 generation, the worldwide. Quite opposite of the culture he's coming from. So Gabor basically dedicated his whole life dealing with trauma in a way, and discovering the topic and the influence of trauma in his life for many years later, right? But in his professional career, he was, dealing with patients from various groups, from palliative care to, nurseries. Mm-hmm. So he was dealing with children. He was dealing with people at the end of their life.
Yep.
And over the course of many years during his practice, he noticed commonalities, right?
Yes.
Yeah, something that binds them all together.
Yeah.
Which is the thing that you emphasize so much, called trauma. Mm-hmm. And before we go into trauma and the myth of Norma and why the book is called that,